God has a plan for this church in this city at this time. And it's not the same as the other church in that other town that did a really cool thing last year. It's my responsibility as a pastor and spiritual leader in my church to discover what God wants in this season, in this community, using the ministry of our church.
The Fresh Church Podcast.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Fresh Church Podcast. I'm Pastor Tony. Let's talk about finding out God's plan for your ministry. How do you know what God wants you to do? What programs, messages, theming, focus should I put my energy into this next year, this next season? How do I find out what God's plan is? You know, as pastors and church leaders, the people in our congregation think for some reason that we have like a direct line to God. I mean, I remember wishing one time that I would open my email and God would have a message in my inbox telling me exactly what to do. I mean, wouldn't that be nice? Sometimes I think the people out there believe that we have an in with the big guy. Well, a few months ago, I put out a podcast about learning to hear God's voice, and it's called Does God Still Speak? That I would highly recommend watching after you get done with this episode. It'll help you understand some of the concepts that I'll be discussing and help you with learning how to communicate in relationship with your Creator. Today, I want to look specifically at finding out what God is speaking to you in regards to ministry. Lead pastors and elders carry a huge responsibility to know the direction that Christ is directing his church. But even as executive pastors, youth pastors, kids directors, whatever your title is, we still play a role in this process. There's a concept right from the beginning that I want to share with you, and you'll hear me mention this over and over again, that God has a plan for this church in this city at this time. Let me say it again, and make sure you write it down. God has a plan for this church in this city at this time. And you play a part in that plan, just like every ministry within your church. Our family loves national parks. Our family's visited 34 of them. That's not counting national monuments or battlefields and all the other national stuff out there. By the way, that's like half of the national parks in the United States. We still got a ways to go. And each park is different, very different. So let me give you an example. When we visited Indiana Dunes, which is just south of Lake Michigan, and there are these beautiful sand dunes that have drifted up off the coast, which, by the way, are very different than either the Pacific or the Atlantic coast end. Okay, and we walked down to the shore and then discovered the incredible challenge of hiking back up the sand to get to the vehicle. A year later, we visited White Sands National Park in New Mexico, and it had a completely different experience. The sand is white, and it looked like snow. In fact, you could even sled on it. It did not absorb heat, but it reflected it. So that meant the sand was refreshingly cool, even though the weather was scorching. We kept the sled to use again in the future, because last year we visited the Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado, and we brought the sled. This one was breathtaking as we climbed up giant mountain dunes with the backdrop revealing peaks of the Rockies covered in snow. We learned quickly that not only did this sand get hot, but sleds didn't actually work on it. You had to use snowboards. The sled stayed there. 3 locations, all focused on sand. 3 completely different experiences. And not one of them was anything like the sand at Death Valley. We found that out with caves, having gone through Mammoth Cave and Carlsbad Caverns. They're very different. Even the way that you enter the caves, how you go through the caves, how long they are, how big they are, how many spots there are to stop. And then even experiencing some of the smaller caves at Great Basin and Pinnacles National Park. Each one was different. The difference between the Badlands National Park in South Dakota versus the Badlands at Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota. It's just Badlands, right? No, they're very different. They're mountains. You've got Mount Rainier National Park, one big mountain that's the main focus. You've got Olympic National Park, which is a whole range of mountains that goes all the way down to the ocean. Crater Lake, Lassen Volcanic National Park, Yosemite. They're all very different in their own way. Then it increases even more as you stretch east to the Guadalupe National Park. Okay, or if you go to the Grand Tetons, or way over the Great Smoky Mountains in the Appalachians. Mountains are the highlights, but it's significantly different from one park to the next. And that isn't even taking in the mountains of Alaska and Hawaii, which, by the way, are still on our list. We will get there. We've been to both borders. Glacier National Park spilling over into Canada is significantly different than walking through the Rio Grande at Big Bend National Park in Texas. The Grand Canyon looks completely different than the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, although they have a similar story. Look at the state of Utah. You've got Arches, Canyonland, Capitol Reef, Bryce, and Zion, each one unique in its own way. My middle daughter started the week by saying, "It's dirt and rocks. I hate dirt and rocks." But by the end, she was mesmerized by the waterfall in the Rocky Canyon of Zion, which, by the way, is now her favorite park. It's just rocks, but they're all unique in their own way. What about the vegetation? Sequoia National Park, with its monstrous redwoods, very different from the towering Redwoods National Park on the coast. Both redwoods, but they're not the same kind of redwoods. And very different from the trees at Petrified Forest National Park, scattered all over the ground. Different still from the Dr. Seuss looking trees at Joshua Tree. Here are the classical looking cacti at Saguaro National Park. The difference between exploring the indigenous dwellings at Mesa Verde or the call to the west at Gateway Arch in St. Louis, which, by the way, is very different than Delicate Arch in Arches National Park. Are you getting the picture? Each national park has their own story. It may be similar to other parks, but they are not the same. God has a plan for your church in your city at this time. Your job is to discover it. So let's start at the beginning. Your church. Take time to know everything about your church. Start with a history. Do you know how long it's been there? How many pastors has it had? How many different locations has it had? You know, my first position out of college was a youth pastor for a short time in Iowa. I was the first youth pastor they'd ever had, and I quickly realized they had no idea what to do with a second pastor on staff. There was a learning curve for both this young minister and this growing church. I spent like half of my Sundays in the sound booth, probably not the best use of a pastor. I currently attend a church that was the first church in its denomination 110 years ago. And my first 6 months, everyone told me that story. They're proud of their history. I can't ignore it. What kind of ministry have they done in the past? What worked and what didn't work? Are there wealthy attenders, influential attenders, middle class, homeless, young, old? Did they do VBS in the park or giant youth rallies? You know, I have a pastor friend who decades ago started doing an annual youth service at Disney World. That's an important thing in the history of this pastor and this church. Why? Because I heard about it 3 times in the 3 days I was there. It's obviously important to them. Talk to the veterans in your church. Talk to the elders. Talk to your pastor. Find out as much as you can. Let me take it a step farther. What problems have occurred over the years? You see, the devil isn't very creative. He often attacks the same way over and over and over again. Churches have a history of financial embezzlement, sexual failures, divorce in pastoral staff, or divisions causing multiple church splits. Knowing what Satan has used against this church in the past will cause you to use safeguards in the future. We took a position at a church and discovered in the first 6 months that many of the staff there had gone through a divorce, or were going through a divorce, or had spouses that refused to attend the church or have anything to do with the church at all. And immediately we reinforced the safeguards in our marriage and started providing a safe place for the key leaders and pastors on staff to come when they needed prayer, support, or just an ear to listen. And little did we know that this would prepare us for our next assignment at our next church, where we oversaw a marriage ministry impacting hundreds of couples in small groups, date nights, and marriage events. What are the politics of your church? How does the government run within your church? Who reports to who? How has that worked in the past? How does that work in the position that you have right now? Has there been breakage in that before? Those are the kind of things you need to know. On that note, who's had your position in the past? What did they do well? What did they fail at? You need to know this because people love to compare. You know how many times I've done an event and then had somebody tell me afterwards, you know what, that was so much better than the last guy. Or you know what, the other guy did a better job. You never like hearing that one, right? But it's there. So I like to find out in advance. I like to have an answer prepared to know that history. So we understand our history, but what about our present? What is the church doing right now? What is the reputation it has in the community? What do people say when your attenders tell them what church you go to? When you say, I go to this church, do they say, oh, that church? Or, I've never heard of that church. Isn't that the church that used to be? And you can fill in the blank, right? I've heard great things about that church. I've always wanted to go check that church out, or I will never go back there again. This ties into our next point about what's happening in your community, but your town, your city. But before we jump into that, there's another discussion that needs to be had about your church. What is your church's plan for the future? You probably heard this in the interview or the onboarding process when you started. It often includes discussions about a remodel or a new building or something, and sometimes a new ministry area that you want to reach. Usually it has something to do with continued growth. And there's not always a lot of ideas how to do it, but we all want to get there. Remember, God has a plan for this church in this city at this time. So what's happening in your city? Have you checked out the history of your town? Do you know what the current events are? Find a coffee shop with a couple of old guys in the morning and ask them what they think the biggest needs of the city is. They will tell you. Your church has been placed in your city for a reason. And that might be different than when the church started out. What are the biggest needs of your town that are not being met? If you have a homeless population that everyone ignores, maybe that's your place. Or if you have a homeless population that everyone addresses, maybe there's another place to help. I was in a church where I worked with local schools in the past, but the new lead pastors, it wasn't a priority to them, and they weren't really doing that any longer. So I looked to see if we needed to start that back up again, only to find out 6 other churches in town had picked up the mantle and were doing a great job. But no one was partnering with special needs organizations in town. There became our opportunity. What can you do in your city to meet its needs? Now, I understand that your role may limit the sphere of impact you have, but you have an impact. In one of the churches I was at, we discovered that every church in town and every school did something for Halloween. So we didn't. There was a local Christian organization that organized a New Year event for students. So we joined them rather than trying to compete with them. There was an incredible leadership team that organized serving at the mission. So we volunteered versus trying to reinvent the wheel. There were shut-ins that our students could go visit. There was very little activities for kids outside of summer VBS and Halloween. So what if we did something on another holiday, like Veterans Day, spring break? There were things we could do in our community that met the needs of our community that no one else was doing. Next time you're on one of those social media groups, instead of trying to find out what everybody else is doing that's the same as everybody else, find out what people are doing that is unique. What are they doing in their city that maybe could spark an idea for you in your city? But make sure it's a need of your city. You see, you can only find out what these needs are in your city by talking to people. You can start with people in your church, but go outside the walls. Visit a city council meeting, a school board meeting, a community gathering. Ask if you can take someone else out for coffee, and not for spiritual reasons, just to find out what's going on in your town. Talk to the other people in your city that have the same position as you, other youth leaders or kids leaders. Find out what they do that they rock at. Find out what things that they could do better at and offer to help them along the way. Or maybe they'll share with you some needs that the town has that they know they're not equipped to be able to take care of. You might be the person, your church might be the church to reach that need. And remember, just because somebody else on Facebook did it, or you did it at your last church, or you heard about it at a conference, doesn't mean that it's what your city needs. Pray for discernment and direction. Pray for the right doors to open. And pray that when those doors open, you'll be ready. God has a plan for this church in this city at this time. Timing is everything. The plan God had for your church 20 years ago might not be the plan God has for your church right now, to the surprise of some of the elders on your board. The plan God has for your church right now might not be the plan he has for you 20 years from now. In fact, you might not even be the person God intended to fulfill that plan down the road. But you are a part of the plan God has for your church right now. And if you aren't, it's time to resign. So what is his plan right now? I often think of Jesus walking through the Samaritan landscape with his disciples. And in John chapter 4, we see this. He's getting so many disciples come to him that the Pharisees are getting upset. He's got more than John the Baptist. And so he goes through Samaria and he takes his disciples with him. And Jews did not go through Samaria. It was just like, it was standoffish. You didn't talk to Samaritans. They were horrible. They were outsiders, the whole thing. And Jesus, he stops at a well that Jacob had built thousands of years before. And he sends his disciples into town to get some food. And as they go into town, a lady from town comes to the well. She goes to get some water, and Jesus asks her for a drink. He asks her for some water. The fact that he was talking to a Samaritan woman would have been completely against the norm. It would have been against the rules. No one would have accepted that. Even her responding put her in jeopardy of being judged accordingly. And as they have a conversation, he ends up revealing to her that he knows her, that she's had 5 husbands and is now living with another person. Okay, and he doesn't judge her for that. They talk about spiritual things, and Jesus says, you know what, but we're going to worship in spirit and in truth. And when they get done talking, she runs back into town. And the disciples show up, and they're like, what happened? What's going on? And all of a sudden, people start coming out to hear the good news, to hear that the Messiah has come. And at the end of this passage, Jesus is having a conversation with his disciples. And check out what it says here. I love these verses. John chapter 4, beginning at the end of verse 35, it says this. But I say, wake up and look around. The fields are already ripe for harvest. The harvesters are paid good wages, and the fruit they harvest is people brought to eternal life. What joy awaits both the planter and the harvester alike. You know the saying, one plants, another harvests. And it's true. I sent you to harvest where you didn't plant. Others have already done the work, and now you will get to gather the harvest. I love this example of a farmer. You see, there's a time to prepare the soil, to plant the seed, to water the crop, to harvest and sell the crop, and then to start it all over again, whether that's with a different crop or the same crop. There are specific seasons that we operate in. You might be in any one of those seasons right now, or all of those seasons right now. Maybe you're watering the crop of yesterday to see a harvest for tomorrow. Maybe you're harvesting something that you had nothing to do with, but you're enjoying the benefits of it. Maybe you're in a season of tilling up the soil for what the future holds. But I see too many churches, they start to grow corn, and then when it doesn't produce fast enough, they rip it up and they plant carrots. And then another pastor comes along and he doesn't want carrots, he wants hay so he can feed other cattle. And so they rip up all the carrots and start growing hay, and then someone else comes along and they're just too tired to do it, and nothing happens, and the crop is a failure. What is the plan that God has for you right now? You see, your leadership should have a heartbeat on this. They should know what's going on. And pacing and timing is so important in the business world. Well, it's even more important in church. The people in your church are eclectic, and all they want to do is everything. Kind of like sheep, right? You point them in the right direction. So knowing the timing of ministry is one of the hardest things as leaders that we have to do. Sometimes we have to admit that we missed that perfect timing, and now it's too late. Sometimes we have to decide, how do we communicate this or start it, or at what pace do we continue it? How do we balance this ministry idea with everything else going on, especially if we haven't weeded out the yesterday ideas that are no longer relevant or effective or in the plan that God has at this time? Do we go now? Do we go next year? Do we go halfway? Do we go all in? They're all tough questions. So I have an answer. You ready? Pray until you hear, and then stick to it. King Saul had an answer, but he chose to do his own thing. He sacrificed without Samuel. He didn't slaughter his enemy to the full extent he was told to do so, and he lost his kingdom. James chapter 1 tells us in verse 5, if you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and he will give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking. But he doesn't end there in verse 6. But when you ask him, be sure that your faith is in God alone. Do not waver, for a person who is divided, loyalty is as unsettled as a wave of the sea that is blown and tossed by the wind. Such people should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Their loyalty is divided between God and the world, and they're unstable in everything they do. Matthew 7:7 in the NIV, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. So how do I find out what is the plan that God has for my church in my city at this time? Well, discover everything you can about your church. Explore the needs and desires of your community and find out what the time of your church is right now, specifically within the vision of your leaders. And then get on your knees. I remember one day in November, years ago, when I got on my knees in the room that we use for kids' church, and I just prayed, God, what is the plan you have for this ministry, in this church, in this community at this time? And immediately I jumped in my Bible to Ephesians 6, the armor of God. And I started praying the armor over my life, my family, our leaders. Lord, put the armor of God on me. Lord, help Lewis to put the armor of God on him, I would pray. Lord, help Pastor Mark to put on the full armor of God and to stand firm. I put together a plan, and I created this space-themed Armor of God series in both preschool and elementary, which, by the way, is still one of my favorite series to this day. In the first half of that next year, I experienced more spiritual warfare than I think I ever have had. And I'm not trying to be that guy who's looking for a demon in every shadow, but we wrestle not against flesh and blood, right? Our church, our leadership, our volunteers, our families, they went through all kinds of issues in that season. But having done all to stand, we stood therefore. I'm not saying that I single-handedly saved the church. I just did what God told me to do. And we discovered once again that we are more than conquerors, that no weapon formed against us will prosper, that greater is he who's in me than he that's in the world. And after that season, I found myself not only doubling my volunteer base and seeing shifts in attitudes and even programming options, but now I was launching a middle school program and marriage ministry in our church and taking new ground. We had done what he asked us to do in November, and now we're ready to take on new challenges the following September. You have a job. Discover what God's planned for your church, the specific ministry that you oversee in your town, in your city, in your community at this time. Because the only thing more important than timing is knowing that it's his timing. All right, so we wrap that up, knowing what God's will is for your church and your community at this time. And this is a segment we call Fresh Access. This is where I just talk after the fact, just kind of share some additional thoughts. You know, one of the best ways that I would challenge you as far as knowing what that is, about knowing your church, knowing your history, knowing what direction you're going in vision, is doing an assessment. Okay, and we offer assessments with our online labs. We'll teach you how to walk through that. Also, when I do coaching, I help people either virtually do an assessment, or I'll come out, depending on the level of their coaching, and do an assessment in their church. And one of the things about that is it helps you see things from a different perspective. And you write it all down, and then you can go back to it a year later and you go, wow, so these were the things that we wanted to do, or these were the things that we were doing. And look how the timing of God has changed that. Or, oh, you know what? God told us to do this and we haven't yet. We need to step it up and do that. And you know what? I would love to have that opportunity to come out if you ever need extra help. Maybe you could have me come out and speak at a parenting conference or marriage seminar or a volunteer training, and then we just throw in an assessment over the weekend at half price. Be able to help you out know what that future looks like. And so in ending, I just want to share a quick story with you. I was part of a mega church in the Seattle area, and something that was taught to me then was that importance of knowing God's time. And there was a cliche that was used there all the time in our staff meetings. It was wait and pray until you hear from God, and then run to do it. And we had that in everything we did. We would pray and pray and pray. And when God said go, we went. And I remember during 2008, there was a massive recession that was happening and churches were closing. They couldn't handle the debt that they had. And because of the size of our church, the little debt they had that was overwhelming for us wasn't a big deal. We've been really wise with our finances through that season. Didn't have to do layoffs or anything like that. We had extra money in the bank. And church after church would come to us saying, would you please purchase our building? Let us become a campus. Maybe we join. And there was just a season of prayer. Going, God, is this what you want? I mean, we could have added 20 campuses or more during that season. That isn't what God wanted. And when it was all said and done, we had 7 campuses. And a couple of those happened beforehand, some of those during that section. But that was just a time when we said, you know what? We're just going to pray. And when the timing was right, each of those campuses were an answer from God for us. And we ran. I remember we would cancel meetings and we would run up and we'd paint the building so we could have it open in 2 weeks. We would do whatever it took to fulfill God's timing, to see the mission of our church in our city be fulfilled in the timing of God. I want to challenge you to do the same. As a leader in your church, make sure that you're not just praying for what you're doing, but pray to see, hey, what's God's plan? What's going on as we look at what God's plan is for your church in your city at this time. Hey, this is Pastor Tony reminding you to keep your ministry fresh.